There is a silent assumption that runs through centuries of Christian imagination. When the word Antichrist appears, a very specific figure almost automatically appears in the modern mind. A final, singular, strategic enemy emerging in the last moments of history to confront Christ before judgment. He already seems to have a script, a political rise, a period of global deception, a decisive confrontation. But there is a curious detail in this familiarity. When we return to the point of origin of the word in the biblical text itself, this figure still does not have all these contours. The term appears in letters attributed to John in a very specific context, warnings against teachings that denied central aspects of Christ's identity, not as a description of a future ruler, nor as a fully developed eschatological character, but as a way of identifying a concrete theological opposition. And there comes something that usually goes unnoticed. The text speaks of antichrists in the plural, more than one, not as a character expected at the end of the story, but as manifestations of opposition that were already present at that moment. This creates an interesting contrast, because the later imagination of Christianity, especially in the West, would end up fixing something very different, a singular Antichrist, located at a specific moment in the future, inserted in a dramatic sequence that precedes the end. How did this transformation happen? At some point in the history of interpretation, a word used to identify present opposition began to be integrated into a narrative about the story's ultimate enemy. But this change did not happen all at once. In the first centuries of Christianity, the communities that read these texts were still trying to understand something much bigger: how exactly the outcome of history would be according to the Scriptures. Daniel spoke of kingdoms and arrogant power. The second letter to the Thessalonians mentioned a man of lawlessness. The Apocalypse featured beasts, persecution, and judgment. The Johannine letter spoke of antichrists. These elements were there, but they still did not automatically form a single organized narrative line. It's as if the material is present, but the complete map is still being drawn. And that means that for a significant period of Christian history, there was more than one way to connect these pieces. Some readers emphasized the continued presence of Antichrist forces throughout history. Others began to see in these texts clues of a conflict concentrated in a final moment. It may seem like a small distinction, but this is exactly where the story starts to move. Because at some point between the first Christian generations and the formation of the later tradition, one of these ways of organizing biblical material began to gain more strength than the others. The word remained the same, the text too, but the place that this word would occupy within the narrative of the end of history would begin to change. And this change did not just arise from an exegetical detail. It was born from a much broader question. If the story is really heading towards an outcome, how exactly should that outcome be imagined? To understand why certain interpretations gained strength in the first centuries of Christianity, it is necessary to remember something that today may seem distant. The first Christian communities did not read the Scriptures as if observing a remote horizon. For many of them, the end of the story seemed near. This expectation does not arise just from an isolated reading of a verse. It is formed from a set of texts that point to a decisive culmination of history. Eschatological discourses in the Gospels, apocalyptic images inherited from the book of Daniel, the intense language of the apocalypse, and the apostolic warnings about persecution, apostasy, and judgment. All of this created a particular interpretative environment. The texts were not just analyzed, they were vivid, and the historical context reinforced this feeling. Sporadic persecutions, political instability in the Roman world, and internal conflicts within Christian communities themselves meant that biblical images of final conflict did not seem abstract. To many early readers, they seemed to describe the very time in which they were living. This detail greatly changes the way texts are read. When the end seems distant, interpretations tend to become more speculative. But when the end seems near, the question changes. The question is no longer, what does this mean in the future? And it becomes, is this already happening? It is in this environment that texts about opposition to Christ begin to be interpreted in different ways. Some ancient Christian authors saw in these texts the description of spiritual and ideological forces that were already operating within history. Emerging heresies, hostile leadership, or persecuting political systems they hate being understood as expressions of this pattern of opposition. Other readers, looking at passages like 2 Thessalonians, where the figure of the man of lawlessness appears, began to consider the possibility of a more concentrated confrontation in the future. But at this early stage of the tradition, these readings still existed, side by side. There was still no rigid consensus that would fit all texts into a single mandatory sequence. Some patristic commentaries treated Antichrist as a future figure. Others emphasized the recurring presence of antichristic forces throughout the history of the church. In certain contexts, the focus was more on political persecution. In others, about doctrinal deviations. In other words, the interpretative field was still open. It may seem like a technicality, but it's important to realize what this reveals. Early Christian interpreters were trying to answer a question that had no definitive form. How exactly do the various eschatological texts of Scripture relate to one another? Daniel, Revelation, Jesus' speeches, apostolic warnings, all spoke of conflict, judgment, and historical outcome. But how to connect these pieces was still in process. And here comes an element that often goes unnoticed. The pressure did not just come from the biblical text. It also came from the historical time lived by the communities. If persecutions arose, they could be read in light of the prophecies. If false teachings appeared, they could be understood as signs of the spiritual conflict described in the apostolic letters. This created a dynamic, interpretive environment where different readings were not just academic debates. They were attempts to understand the present moment within salvation history. But as the centuries progressed, a new situation began to emerge. Christianity continued to exist. Communities organized themselves. Institutional structures were strengthened. And the inevitable question began to appear more strongly. What happens to a community that expected an imminent end and continues across generations? There is a delicate point in the history of Christian eschatological expectations that rarely appears when the topic is presented in a simplified form. The tension was not just between different interpretations of certain texts. She was between time and continuity. In the first centuries, many Christian communities lived under the impression that the outcome of history could occur within the horizon of the present generation. This expectation shaped the reading of Scripture and also the way in which the signs of the time were perceived. But the story is not over. The decades passed. Then came new centuries. Churches were founded in different regions of the Mediterranean world. Pastoral structures began to consolidate. The transmission of faith began to involve formation, catechesis, and continuous teaching. And slowly a problem arose that was not only theological, but also historical. How can we keep eschatological expectations alive without transforming the life of the community into a permanent state of suspension? This question does not appear explicitly in a single ancient treatise, but it traverses the evolution of Christian thought about the end. If the expectation of the outcome was too immediate, any delay could generate frustration or confusion. But if the expectation were completely diluted, the eschatological meaning of the Scriptures would also run the risk of losing strength. Between these two poles, a new interpretive need began to emerge. Organizing the future, not in the sense of predicting dates, but of building a narrative that allowed communities to understand how different eschatological elements could relate within a story that continued to advance. This movement begins to appear more noticeably when Christian interpreters begin to look for sequences within the biblical material. Instead of reading each passage in isolation, the effort grows to connect different texts into an intelligible order. Daniel speaks of successive kingdoms. Revelation describes periods of conflict and judgment. The second letter to the Thessalonians mentions an opposition figure who manifests himself before the final outcome. The Johannine letters speak of Antichrists present in history. The question starts to become more specific. Do these pieces describe different phenomena that are repeated throughout history or parts of the same eschatological sequence? This distinction changes more than it seems. If they are recurring phenomena, opposition to Christ may appear many times in different forms over the centuries. But if they are part of a final sequence, then these texts begin to point to a concentrated moment in history, where the scattered elements would converge in a decisive conflict. This shift did not happen instantly. For quite some time, however, both possibilities continued to be present in the Christian interpretative horizon. But as the theological tradition developed and the life of the church became more institutionalized, the idea of an organized narrative structure for the end of history began to offer something that communities increasingly needed: coherence, theological predictability. It is a way of maintaining eschatological expectations without putting it in permanent conflict with the continuity of history itself. It is at this point that the interpretation begins to change direction, because when different texts begin to be aligned within a sequence, some elements that were previously just patterns of opposition begin to gain another possibility of reading. They can begin to be seen as characters within a larger eschatological plot. And it is exactly at this moment that the figure of the Antichrist begins to occupy a new place within the architecture of the end. When early Christian interpreters began trying to organize the different eschatological texts of Scripture, something curious happened. The tickets have not changed. What changed was the way of connecting them. Daniel continued to describe successive kingdoms and a power that would rise arrogantly against God. The second letter to the Thessalonians still spoke of a man of lawlessness who would appear before the final outcome. The apocalypse continued to feature beasts, persecution, and judgment. And the Johannine letters continued to mention antichrists who were already present in history. For a time, these texts could be read as descriptions of recurring conflicts within Christian history. But gradually, another interpretative possibility began to emerge, and she had a very specific characteristic. Rather than viewing these elements as dispersed manifestations over time, some interpreters have begun to align them as parts of a progressive eschatological sequence. First would come a period of increasing tension within the story. Then a great apostasy would arise. Then a concentrated figure of opposition would appear, and finally, the decisive confrontation that would precede the judgment would occur. It may seem like just a technical reorganization of texts, but in practice, this produced a significant change, because when different passages are integrated within the same narrative sequence, they are no longer just independent descriptions. They start to function as stages of a plot. And it is exactly at this point that the figure of the Antichrist begins to take on a new form within the Christian tradition. In Johannine letters, the word had been used to describe opponents who were already present in the community. But when interpreters began to align eschatological texts into a historical progression, it became possible to read this opposition not only as a present reality, but also as a climactic moment at the end of history. Opposition to Christ could exist many times, but she could also focus at some point on a final figure who would encapsulate this conflict. This reading did not emerge as an abrupt rupture. It emerged gradually within the interpretative work of the early Christian tradition, especially in authors who sought to harmonize disparate eschatological passages. Some patristic interpreters have begun to associate the figure mentioned in 2 Thessalonians with the final adversary described in readings from Daniel and with symbolic elements of Revelation. When these associations become more frequent, something new happens. The interpretative field begins to reorganize. What were once multiple manifestations of opposition are now seen as preparation for a singular, final conflict. This displacement has an important effect on the eschatological imagination because it offers a way to transform complex and varied texts into a comprehensible narrative. Instead of various forms of opposition spread throughout history, the tradition begins to envision a concentrated eschatological climax. And within this climax, the figure of the Antichrist begins to occupy a specific role. It is no longer just a term used to identify theological opponents. He begins to be understood as the final adversary who appears immediately before God's decisive intervention in history. Here is the turning point that alters the trajectory of interpretation. Previously, the concept functioned mainly as a descriptive category of opposition within Christian history. Afterwards, he also starts to function as a character within the narrative of the end. This change was gradually accepted for several reasons. First, because it helped to harmonize biblical passages that seemed to speak of different conflicts. Second, because it created a clear narrative structure for eschatological teaching. And third, because it allowed Christian communities to maintain the expectation of the outcome of history without having to deal with each historical crisis as the last definitive event. In other words, this reading offered historical intelligibility. But there is one important detail that is rarely considered. This interpretation was not the only possible one. If the Christian tradition had emphasized more strongly the reading of the Johannine letters as a permanent description of multiple forms of opposition to Christ, later imagery might have followed a different path. Instead of a concentrated final enemy, the focus could have remained on the idea of recurring patterns of opposition that run throughout history. But as the centuries progressed, reading that integrated texts into an organized eschatological sequence began to gain more space. She was didactic, it was coherent, and it allowed us to connect different parts of Scripture into a single narrative about the final destination of history. It may seem like just an interpretative reorganization, but its consequences were profound. Because from that point on, the question was no longer just whether there would be antichrists throughout history. The question became different. When will the final Antichrist appear that precedes the end of history? There is a decisive moment in the trajectory of any theological idea. It's not just when it's formulated, that's when it becomes teachable. Because complex interpretations can circulate for a long time in comments, debates, and treatises. But to really shape the imagination of a tradition, they need to cross another path, that of daily transmission, homilies, catechesis, pastoral teaching, collective memory. And it is exactly at this point that the reading of Antichrist as the final enemy begins to gain an important advantage within the Christian tradition. The interpretation that had begun to organize the eschatological texts into a sequence, apostasy, final adversary, decisive conflict, and judgment, had a characteristic that would become extremely powerful. She was narratable. It was possible to count it, explain it, memorize it. When Christian teaching began to expand into larger and larger communities, this narrative clarity made a difference. Instead of presenting a multiplicity of possible Antichrist manifestations throughout history, it was possible to convey a relatively simple structure. The story moves towards a final moment. Before this outcome, great opposition will arise, and this opposition will be concentrated in a figure who rises up against Christ. This type of organization not only facilitated teaching, it also helped to integrate different parts of Scripture into a single accessible explanation. Daniel could be connected to the apocalypse. The man of lawlessness of 2 Thessalonians could be interpreted within the same framework. And the warnings of the Johannine letters about Antichrists could be understood as prefigurations or partial manifestations of the final conflict. It may seem like just a pedagogical solution, but it produces an important effect, because when an interpretation begins to circulate in teaching processes, it begins to shape the way entire generations learn to read texts. And slowly, the interpretive question also changes. Instead of asking whether the Antichrist should be understood in a multiple or recurring way within the story, many readers start to ask when exactly the final figure will appear. It's a subtle change, but it is a real change. Another factor contributes to this process. Eschatological language has always had a strong imagery component. Beasts, thrones, cosmic conflicts, judgment. These images do not just function as abstract concepts, they create mental pictures. When the Christian tradition begins to associate these images with a progressive narrative of the end of history, eschatological teaching takes on an almost dramatic form. There is development, there is growing tension, and there is a final confrontation. Within this narrative, the Antichrist begins to occupy a very specific place. He functions as the embodiment of the ultimate conflict between human opposition and divine authority. This does not mean that other readings immediately disappeared. For a long time, different interpretations continued to coexist within the Christian tradition. Some authors have continued to emphasize the recurring presence of antichristic forces throughout history. Others maintained more symbolic readings of certain apocalyptic texts. But as Christian teaching expanded and needed clear narrative structures to convey eschatology, readings that organized texts into a final sequence became increasingly influential. Sometimes, an interpretation doesn't stick just because it offers the most sophisticated analysis. Sometimes it wins because it offers the most transmissible way of telling the story. And when this transmissibility meets centuries of continuous teaching, something begins to happen. What was once just one of several ways connecting texts begins to seem like the natural way of understanding them. This process does not yet represent the final stage of consolidation, but it sets the stage for something that would become decisive in the following centuries. Because when an interpretation is already deeply rooted in catechesis, preaching, and collective memory, the next step is not just its repetition, it is its systematization within a broader theological tradition. And this is exactly what begins to happen when Christian thought enters the medieval period. When Christian thought entered the medieval period, something important began to happen to many ideas that had emerged in previous centuries. They no longer circulate only as interpretations among other possible ones, and they begin to be integrated into broader theological systems. Eschatology is no exception. Throughout the Middle Ages, Christian reflection went through an intense process of intellectual organization. Biblical commentaries are produced in large quantities. Theological compilations attempt to harmonize previous traditions, and clerical training increasingly demands conceptual clarity. Within this environment, interpretations that had already been gaining ground began to acquire greater stability. The reading of the Antichrist as the final figure of history finds favorable ground in this context, not because it emerges as a completely new idea, but because it can now be integrated into a more systematic theological architecture. Medieval eschatology tends to organize the end of history as a relatively defined sequence. Before the final judgment, there will be a period of tribulation. Within this period, concentrated opposition to the Christian faith will emerge. This opposition will be associated with an identifiable figure, often described as the Antichrist. And after this confrontation, God's definitive intervention in history will occur. This type of organization does not mean that all details were understood in the same way by all authors, but the general structure starts to become recognizable. It may seem like a natural development, but there is an important point here. The consolidation of an interpretation does not happen just because it is repeated. It happens when different layers of the tradition start to use it simultaneously. And this began to occur quite strongly during the Middle Ages. In biblical commentaries, the Antichrist appears as part of the reading of eschatological passages. In systematic theology, it is integrated into the narrative of the story's outcome. In preaching, the figure functions as a moral and eschatological warning. And in the popular imagination, this narrative begins to take on increasingly concrete contours. This last point is especially interesting because when a theological interpretation crosses clerical teaching and reaches the collective imagination, it gains a new form of permanence. It no longer exists only in books and debates. It comes to exist in the way entire communities imagine the future of history. In this environment, the idea of a final adversary fits quite effectively. She offers a recognizable figure to represent the climax of the conflict between good and evil. It connects different biblical passages within the same narrative, and it allows the eschatological outcome to be presented clearly within the Christian tradition. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this process is another. This is not the moment when the interpretation arises. It is the moment when it stops seeming like one possibility among others. When ideas traverse centuries of commentary, teaching, and cultural transmission, they begin to take on an appearance of inevitability. What was previously the result of progressive interpretative choices is now perceived as a natural part of the received tradition. And so the figure of Antichrist as the final enemy of history becomes, for much of medieval Christianity, a recognizable piece within the eschatological architecture, not as the only reading ever proposed throughout history, but as one that managed to stabilize with enough strength to shape the theological and cultural imagination of the following centuries. From this point on, the question about the Antichrist no longer circulates only among specialized interpreters. It becomes part of a widely shared eschatological narrative. And when an idea reaches this level of consolidation, its consequences rarely remain limited to the period in which it stabilized. They continue to echo far beyond him. When an interpretation spans centuries of teaching, biblical commentary, and cultural transmission, it begins to have a silent effect. It is no longer perceived as one of several possible readings. It becomes simply the way the text has always been understood. This is exactly the point at which medieval tradition leaves its deepest mark on the eschatological imagination of the Christian. Ism. Over the centuries, the idea of a final Antichrist, inserted in a sequence that precedes the final judgment, has become a recognizable part of the architecture of the end of history. It circulated in biblical commentaries, was transmitted in catechesis processes, appeared in devotional narratives, and became part of the way in which many Christian communities imagined the outcome of human history. Over time, this narrative structure became familiar. First would come a period of increasing tension. Then a concentrated opposition would emerge. Then the decisive confrontation would take place. And then the final judgment would come. Within this scheme, the figure of Antichrist does not appear in isolation. It functions as the point of convergence of the eschatological conflict. This structure would continue to influence Christian thought well beyond the Middle Ages, even when new theological currents emerge during the Reformation in subsequent debates and in the various modern eschatological traditions. The idea of a final adversary remains a recurring reference. In some contexts, it is reinterpreted. In others, it is reorganized within new eschatological systems. But the figure remains recognizable, and this reveals something interesting about the history of biblical interpretations. Texts can remain the same for centuries, but the way communities learn to organize these texts into understandable narratives can change significantly over time. In the case of the idea of the Antichrist, what began as a term used in Johannine letters to describe opponents present in the community ended up being integrated over centuries of reflection and teaching within a much broader eschatological narrative. A narrative in which the conflict between Christ and his opponents does not appear only as a recurring reality of history, but as a final climax that precedes the definitive outcome. It may seem like this way of imagining the end has always been there, but when we look at the historical path of interpretation, we see something a little more complex. The concept went through different readings. It circulated in patristic debates. It was reorganized when interpreters began to align eschatological texts into narrative sequences. It gained strength when it became transmissible within catechesis, and it ended up being consolidated when it was integrated into the theological and cultural architecture of the medieval tradition. The result of this process is still present today. Whenever the figure of the Antichrist appears in theological debates, in prophetic interpretations, or even in cultural narratives about the end of the world, it carries with it centuries of interpretative development. And perhaps this is exactly what makes the history of this idea so revealing. Because when we look back, we are not just looking at how a concept was interpreted. We are observing how a specific way of imagining the end of history took shape over time.